So have the new Arks of Omen rules cast a plague on Death Guard's power in game? Let's talk about the Sons of Mortarion in Arks of Omen. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Death Guard, continuing our look through the 40k factions in the new Arks of Omen. Broadly speaking, I'd say that Death Guard are perhaps one of the armies that have come off worst out of this whole update. The rules that they've got maybe feel like a bit of a side grade compared with what they had before, which maybe isn't amazing seeing as I would have kind of rated them lower mid tier in the previous version of the game. Let's talk through their balance changes, positive and negative. We'll go through the balanced Dataslate changes, Arks of Omen, their points and secondaries changes, and do a bit of an overview at the end. So first up in the balanced Dataslate for the Death Guard, they didn't have the most changes. The big one was of course losing Armour of Contempt. I feel for a fair few factions, Armour of Contempt wasn't perhaps the biggest deal in the world. Perhaps armies that often like to hide their units and then jump out and deal some mass damage is not maybe quite so critical if they're a bit easier to take down in return. But with Death Guard having slow durability and attrition warfare as their main thing, taking a big durability hit like this really is a big deal. For a lot of units, Armour of Contempt would have been giving you a +1 to your saves against the attacks against them, and it's really quite a big hit to things like Plague Marines and Terminators, which won't be as hard to remove from the board as they were. Some units got some decent points cuts to kind of compensate them for the loss of Armour of Contempt, but not everything did, and I feel like for a fair few units, the points cuts maybe just compensate them for losing this rule, but don't actually make them any stronger. It's not a nerf that's really applied to the entire faction absolutely equally though. A few things don't really care quite as much, like say Poxwalkers and Spawn, at least relative to how things were before. Both of those units might be a bit more prominent, and also things with a 3+ save and a 5+ invul maybe don't care as much. Against AP-3 things they'll still be saving on a 5+, it will just make a bit of a difference for AP-1 or 2 though. Demon Engines might take just a slight bit less of a hit, compared with things like say Plague Marines. Definitely a bit of a rough deal though, making 40k's durability faction a bit easier to kill is not going to be a good thing for them. Otherwise, there's plenty of other core rules changes in the Arks of Omen. The new and fairly de-restrictive detachment I think is actually quite useful to the Death Guard. It can allow the list to go very heavy in one direction or another, not needing to take troops as attacks, or potentially even not having to take HQs or extra detachments as attacks if you just want to take more troops. Plague Marines and Poxwalkers are still looking like some of the better units in the Codex. In theory, you could just run an entire army of around about 100 Plague Marines now if you wanted. That's probably overkill, but even without Armour of Contempt, it's going to be annoying to remove them from the objectives, never mind their fairly decent melee damage with all their free gear. If you wanted to spam zombies, then you could think about running around about 160 Poxwalkers in the list if you wanted to. 8 units of 20 Poxwalkers, then backed up by 4 units of Plague Marines, 3 units of Death Shroud, and a unit of Blight Lords. Again, that's just going to be enough raw wounds to put on objectives that I feel like it's going to give some armies a bit of trouble, even if it might be a little bit more advisable to go a bit heavier on support characters or fire support. Feel like you'll probably at least surprise some lists like that, armies that just don't have enough shots to deal with that level of horde. These are things that you could have done before, but it would have cost you a fair amount of command points for additional detachments. Now you can have this and have full amounts of CP. If you wanted to, you could also go very heavy on the Demon Engines or the Terminators as well, just build around a big elites detachment or potentially a fast attack or heavy support one. If you really want to skew to doing one thing, it's a bit easier than before and doesn't cost you command points. At least on paper though, I feel like massive troop spam is perhaps one of the more interesting ways to do things. They perhaps seem some of the most standout units of the Codex now. Otherwise, for the rules changes, one bit of bad news for the Death Guard is that the attacks that ignore way to prevent wounds now ignore disgustingly resilient. I mean to say like Chaos Demon Princes with the Golax relic, that will go straight through it now. Damage 3 really isn't good for the Plague Marines or the Terminators, so will the Tyranid Reaper of Obliterax, and perhaps the most scary of all is that Guard Finial standard, the one that lets core firepower cut straight through modifiers, feel no pain, and now damage modifiers too. Just a bit of bad news there, seeing as it's the faction-wide special rule. Allies got a little bit easier to field. Allied War Dogs or Nurgle Demons now don't cost you any more CP. I feel like people will be experimenting with those a bit. The War Dogs look like a pretty decent match for Death Guard to be honest. Could add some much needed speed and long range fire support. I feel like War Dog Executioners or Brigands don't offer quite the same amount of durability as Plague Burst Crawlers, but the firepower really isn't all that far behind. And being fast and having 5 model objectives secured, I feel like they do have some advantages over them for backfield fire support. Potentially could be worth just trading out a little bit of raw might for some extra objective grabbing skills. I'll certainly be interested to see if any armies wind up using demon allies now. A lot of the Nurgle units went down in points costs, which is good as they weren't amazing before. Beast of Nurgle seem at least fairly intimidating on paper with that awful regeneration mechanic. Finally, for rules changes, the Death Guard also lost the Terminus Est Strike Force supplement, which is kind of sad for them, I think. This was the one from Warzone Charadon, where it gave you a whole bunch of benefits for running mass Poxwalkers. There was a stratagem to have them moving across the board a bit easier, one for regenerating them, and a few other nice tricks. I feel like they probably just should have kept it on until the end of 9th edition, seeing as it doesn't seem all that far away now. It would have been particularly nice now that Poxwalkers are easier to spam than ever. Certainly does cut a little bit of the potential of Horde mode Death Guard. Overall though, some positive and some negative stuff here. Sad to lose the Terminus Est. The preventing wound thing is a bit niche admittedly, but I feel like Arks of Omen plus the option for allied war dogs definitely give you a lot more flexibility with list building. Will be interesting to see what people make of it. Moving onwards, we've got the Death Guard points changes. A lot of units did go down, and a bunch of others got free gear. Within the HQ section, the generic characters generally got a free war gear upgrade. The standard lords and sorcerers don't tend to be taken all that much, but might be a bit more tempting now you get things like free combi melters, power fists, and chain fists. It adds up to around about 20 points worth of free gear for most of them. They seem a lot more viable in comparison with the actual Death Guard specific units like the Lord of Contagion and the Lord of Virulence, though I still wouldn't say that they're flat better or anything. The only other change in the HQ section was that you're able to swap out your Plague Reaper for a Man Reaper plus Orb of Desiccation, if you prefer that for your Lord of Contagion. The Plague Reaper's the damage 3 one, the Man Reaper's the one with the 2 attack modes with an anti-horde mode, the Orb gives you a once per game fairly potent grenade attack. Overall the loadout seemed kind of balanced to me. I could happily take one over the other. The damage 3 is nice, but so is the anti-infantry clearing of the Man Reaper plus the Orb. For the troop section, we've got the Plague Marines going down from 21 points to 19 points. It's a 2-point drop, or minus 10%. I feel like this kind of fairly trades them off for losing Armour of Contempt, and I think it's going to mean that Plague Marines are still going to be perhaps the strongest unit in the whole Death Guard Codex, and are still likely to see play in absolute droves in competitive lists. They still have their free war gear, so they're pretty threatening in melee with those flails and great plague cleavers and things, plus a blight launcher for a little bit of range. Overall, as a unit, I think with the loss of Armour of Contempt, they are still going to be a little bit less durable per point despite the points cut, but decently better in terms of damage dealing. Still very intimidating as a battle line for the army, either on foot or in rhinos, and I feel like they're perhaps one of the most competitive units for the whole Death Guard. Otherwise, for the troops, the cultists get a free flamer and stubber if they want one, but in general, I still think I'd much rather have the improved toughness of the Poxwalkers. For other infantry units and elite choice characters, the Terminators didn't go down in cost, but they got free gear. I feel like overall, sadly, that leaves them a bit weaker than they were before due to the loss of Armour of Contempt. I feel like they could probably have afforded to put them down a few points, perhaps. The free gear is far more meaningful on the Blight Lord Terminators. Within a unit of 5, you could maybe take an autocannon, Plague Spewer, Plague Flail, and a couple of combi weapons. It means they've actually got a fairly scary ranged punch, particularly at close range, though they will have lost some durability. The Death Shroud maybe came off worse out of this. All they get is their free Chimes of Contagion for the boosted Contagions of Nurgle range on the champion. This really doesn't compensate them for losing Armour of Contempt. I feel like they're less good as a result, though probably still usable. The Virion characters all went down a little bit, 5 points off the Taliman Surgeon, Blightbringer, and Biologus Putrefier. The Foul Blightspawn got better though, at minus 10 points compared with what he was. I think he went down more because Games Workshop had previously nerfed him a bit, so he got the bigger drop. Out of these, I'd still rate the Blightspawn and the Taliman as the best overall. The Blightspawn perhaps even more than before, now he's dropped even further. He is pretty savage between that Plague Spewer and those revolting stench vats to make enemies fight last. The Biologus Putrefier as well is now even more viable. I quite like his mortal wounds in melee for Plague Marines. Finally, out of the squads, Possessed didn't get changed, so I feel like they're going to be even more niche and underwhelming compared with Plague Marines. Spawn did get a decent drop though, going down to 21 points, a minus 9% drop, a decent boost, though I thought they were kind of weak before. Not unusable, but I felt like they were a unit that just got overshadowed by the Plague Marines. After this change, and because they don't really care about losing Armour of Contempt, I feel like they gain a fair bit of ground. Certainly feel like a bit more of a tempting option than they were previously, and certainly if you just want single disruptive models to be standing on objectives and getting in the opponent's way, then a trio of these I think really is pretty fine for 63 points. I feel like they're going to create a lot more nuisance than they're really worth in terms of points cost, provided you've got 3 fast attack slots. Finally, there's adjustments to most of the Death Guard vehicles. A lot of them went down, besides the Plague Burst Crawler, which I guess makes it a slight bit less tempting as a result, seeing as it lost durability. The Hellbrutes are down to 105, with all loadouts besides the Las Cannon being free. The Las Cannons are 10 points. Still not too bad as a gun turret, I think, particularly with that Fire Fever stratagem. The Mephitic Blight Hauler got a fairly decent drop from 120 down to 110. The Demon Engines with their 5+ invul saves maybe care about Armour of Contempt just a little bit less than most things. I think it catches up with the Plague Burst Crawler quite a bit with that, though it still probably rates the Plague Burst Crawler as still slightly superior. The Bloat Drones remain at 115 points, though you can now upgrade to the Flesh Mower or the Blight Launcher for free. The Flesh Mower version got a -5 point drop. It's still the loadout that I'd go for out of them, but the Blight Launcher is just a bit more tempting now, particularly if Space Marines become very meta. The Land Raiders got all gear free, but it really just doesn't outweigh the loss of Armour of Contempt on the 2+ save units. The Rhinos got free war gear, including free combi weapons and a Havoc Launcher, which I think is quite nice. Between their 3 guns, they do actually have a significant amount of firepower now. Though again, as mentioned a lot, they will be easier to kill. The Predator also got lots better. It's 115 points, so the base cost is unchanged, but you now get the Heavy Bolter sponsons included for free, plus a Havoc Launcher and combi weapon. Predators were kind of laughably bad before, and even with these rather massive changes, I don't think it's quite enough to have them catch up with the Demon Engines. But if you were running one with Death Guard, you can certainly feel far less bad about it. They're fairly cheap tanks, and packing more guns than they would have been before usually. The Defiler's 175 points, so a +10 there, but again all its war gear free. Overall I feel like they probably didn't need to increase that points cost in trade-off for the free gear. It was perhaps one of the most underwhelming of the Demon Engines, and could have gone down a bit if they'd wanted. Finally, the Miasmic Malignifier is 65 points, that's -10 or 13% drop. I feel like it's reasonable enough as a midfield distraction if you can get it on an objective. Kind of depends whether or not you're playing missions that you know you're going to be able to set it up on without the 3-inch fortification rule getting in your way. Overall, out of all the points cuts, I feel like the Plague Marines came off very well, perhaps the Terminator's a bit worse. The good Virion characters are still good, and out of the vehicles, the Blight Haulers and the Bloat Drones gain a bit on the Plague Burst Crawler. I feel like in general, probably the generic vehicles are still just a little bit overcosted in comparison. Finally, for the rules changes, we've got the new secondary objectives from the Arks of Omen book. Overall, these are slightly improved, and perhaps the best news out of any of them is that Spread the Sickness, the action 1 on objectives, that's completely unchanged, so you're still getting 3 victory points inside your home field and 4 victory points in the midfield. This one's pretty much auto-include for the Death Guard, I think, one of the better secondaries in 40k. Otherwise, Fleeing Vectors I think got decently better, though it's still one that you can only really use in certain matchups. It's the one where you get 2 victory points for killing 7 models, and +1 victory point if you kill those 7 models with plague weapons, and then bonus points, 1 victory point for a morale test failed on the opponent's side, and a +1 victory point on top of that if that unit had a casualty killed by a plague weapon. I guess drive the enemy away, and as they flee they carry the plagues to new foes. The change for this one was that previously you only got the 1 victory point for killing those initial 7 models, and as that's perhaps one of the most easy bits of the whole thing to achieve, that really is quite a significant boost. I feel like that means that if you're playing it against a relatively high body count army, then that's going to be fairly easy to score pretty high on this now. If the game's going okay against a Horde type army, then I suspect that you could probably get around about 9 or 10 victory points fairly reliably. And if they happen to be susceptible to morale, then that's always a possibility to maybe eat up the last few. Definitely worth it, but it's just not going to be a factor in some matchups, say if you're playing Adeptus Custodes or Knights or something. Otherwise, the other one is Despoiled Ground, which maybe isn't terrible as a general purpose fallback one, but on the whole I wouldn't say it's a particularly strong secondary even now. This is the one where you basically get a whole load of rewards at the end of the game for having your Death Guard forces basically all over the battlefield, units in your opponent's deployment zone, covering the objective markers with contagions, and units in each table quarter. This one got very subtly better. The table quarters criteria of it now is just greater than 3 inches from the midlines of the quarters, not greater than 6 inches as it was before, kind of mirroring the change with the engage on all fronts one. Overall, I would rank it as still fairly poor overall. It's basically gambling on winning the damage game against the enemy army, and if you haven't overpowered them and had a fair amount of Death Guard left on the board, you're going to score fairly low for this. Not a bad fallback one if there's literally nothing better, but overall I'd still rate it as fairly weak. From these, I'd say that Death Guard are kind of average on their secondaries, one really good one that's good but very matchup dependent, and one that's kind of mediocre but could be used as a fallback one. So overall, putting it all together, I feel like generally the Arks of Omen update seems to be a bit of a side grade for Death Guard. Some very helpful things like more detachment slots and more flexibility there, some nice points cuts, but all balanced with losing Armour of Contempt and making the game's durability faction a lot less durable. I'd say the main issue from Death Guard is they were kind of coming from a mediocre sort of place within the power rankings of 40k, a win rate of around about 46% or so, not terrible but kind of on the lower mid tier, and a lot of armies around their sort of rank got some bigger buffs I thought. When I did a recent tier list for them, it caused me to think that they're probably going to be one of the weaker armies in Warhammer 40k, but I guess we'll have to see how well theory translates into practice. I'm definitely going to be interested to see what lists people come up with, and whether or not some big troop spam or demon engine spam can work well. In general, with the Arks of Omen changes, I do suspect that lists will be getting a bit more spammy of one thing. Maybe a bit fewer lists that have a few elites and heavy support and some troops. I'd guess armies might well be skewing a bit more to the main focus of the list. I feel like Plague Marines are perhaps a big winner out of this, going to be even more central to the army than they were before. And I could see some lists allying in some demons and knights. Relative to other units, perhaps the Spawn and the Blight Haulers might be a little bit more prominent, and the Plague Burst Crawlers and the Terminators perhaps a little bit less so, though I don't think that the changes are perhaps quite so radical to mean that any of them are just auto-includes or utterly rubbish. As always, let me know your thoughts though. How might you be adapting your Death Guard list to the new meta? And are there any units that you're particularly thinking of putting on the table more, or any less? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will certainly try and keep these Arks of Omen updates coming with one for each faction. If you'd like to check out my equivalent video for the Chaos Space Marines, I'll link it down in the video description below. Finally, if you'd like to help keep these videos coming on Auspex Tactics, I would just like to mention as well that the channel does have a Patreon page, and you'll find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.